Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Jason Snyder. Jason, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Alex. Thanks for inviting me.
It's good to have you back. So as maybe some of our listeners would know, you and I spoke a couple of times on my last show, Agora Politics, about, I think originally we had a discussion with your friend Jared Janes about sort of metamodernism, and we talked a lot about mindfulness. And then later on, we kind of got more into your background and area of expertise, talking about sustainable development, and a little bit about Game B as well, if I remember correctly. But this is a new show. We're doing Hacking State, and part of Hacking State is sort of going up the chain of the human OS, trying to look at different systems of human social organization and how they can be adapted or broken out of. And one of the big things that you're sort of known for in a lot of online spaces now is trying to sort of forge an alternative for different kinds of like local political economies and local sustainable development and community building with your Doomer Optimist project, and of course with your daily work as a faculty member of Appalachian State. So I want to just have you on and talk a little bit about the challenges inherent to that. To get started, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the founding of Doomer Optimism, kind of how it came about as a movement, and where you think the state of it is right now as a community.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's so the first time we talked, so that was with Jared Janes, and we were still doing the Both And podcast. About that time, around beginning 2020, when all the insanity started, that was also a big changing point in my life as well. I had just right before the pandemic, I had just moved to a house with some land. Our family did, to start up a homestead, and I guess my priorities were shifting. Moving from Both And was very much oriented towards kind of big picture, kind of galaxy brain, you can say, Game B, metamodern, whatever, kind of big ideas, right? I think prior to 2020, the big ideas were like what was fun. It seemed relevant. It seemed useful to like rethink a lot of fundamental priors of our society. But 2020 rolls around, just a lot of insanity the next few years, and things get really very real, right? Like it's no longer in the future that some big thing is going to happen. All of a sudden, history is happening, right? It's happening right now, and so that all confluence of factors, my own personal life, things that are happening, everywhere, caused me to really change my focus more towards kind of one, just biophysical realities underpinning this whole human project, right? That could be energy availability, that could be ecological overshoot, that could be climate change, it could be any number of things, and then associated with that, the political, economic, and even mimetic kind of correlates of that. One of my theses is that as biophysical, I won't say collapse. I use the word collapse, but I don't mean that in like a day it's going to all collapse and then that's it. It's more like a process. But the memes will get more and more surreal, right? The people that we blame, the scapegoats, will become more and more bizarre and more like it's going to just become hyper modern, you can say, very kind of surrealist sense.
Yeah.
I met up with a person, Ashley Colby, who was kind of thinking along similar lines, thinking like we need to kind of like get back to what's real, get back to what's tangible, farming, growing food, building things again. And she was kind of the same persuasion. We did a series on the Stoa together, kind of just fleshing out some ideas around this kind of meme of doomer optimism, meaning that like things are in many ways, politically, socially, biophysically, like things are not sustainable, right? They're not going to last. Something has to give, right? So that's the doomer part. But we're also like anti-nihilist. We're like, nihilism is not the response to this. We need to recognize the challenges, the existential challenges, really, but move forward with hope and optimism, basically, at the very least in our own lives, and hopefully that radiates out, beyond our own lives. And so that was really the premise behind Doomer Optimism. It's mainly a podcast, although it's, community, group chats. Sometimes there's various meetups, but the podcast is rolling. We've had about 150 episodes recorded now in less than 2 years. Just lots of fascinating conversations with lots of fascinating people. And it's also operates kind of as a collective where we have at least a dozen hosts, or at least a dozen people who have hosted the podcast. And so, there's a lot of people who are like kind of buying into it and taking partial ownership of the kind of the enterprise. So that's kind of where we are. And we get more into the details as we go through the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I guess that gives people a good place to start. Funnily enough, in preparing for this interview, I'm a developer, so I'm using like GPT in my daily workflow for all kinds of problems. And I thought I'd ask ChatGPT if it knew what Doomer Optimism was. And it turns out it does. It's in its like data set. And so it gave me a response. I'm just going to read to you one of the lines that ChatGPT gave me about what Doomer Optimism is, just because I think this is like just a very funny juxtaposition. So GPT told me, Doomer Optimism acknowledges the difficulties of life, but encourages individuals to seek meaning and fulfillment despite the prevailing gloominess, which is, I guess, in some ways, definitionally what what you would imagine a Doomer optimist to be. But I wanted to ask you, I've seen lately there's a good amount, and I guess this happens on all kinds of with all kinds of Twitter subcultures. There's been a lot of I guess discourse around the movement. I'm not sure. I don't have a close enough view to know if it's coming from inside or if it's coming from outside. So it appears to me as discourse around the movement about sort of various kinds of like infighting and signaling and counter signaling and particular like political affiliations. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask one of the co-founders of the movement, do you think that Doomer Optimism is inherently political in the sense of being partisan? Or is the game that the Doomer Optimists are playing kind of a meta-political move?
I would say it's a meta-political move. So, I mean, people who are attracted to Doomer Optimism as a meme, there's a few kind of core commonalities. Generally, people are not satisfied with status quo. They're kind of doomers in the sense of either, political institutions, social institutions are decaying, or biophysical things, or, what have you. And they're generally interested in kind of like, if not already, kind of seeking out tangible stuff in their lives, as well as meaning and beauty in their lives. And by tangible, I mean like doing stuff with your hands, right? Like, can you build things? Can you fix things? Can you grow things? Where's meaning coming from, right? Are you developing good relationships with, your family, with your neighbors, etc.? So that's kind of a commonality. But people can have that kind of commonality, but have wildly different perspectives on many other things, right? Especially on politics. So, we have some pretty, like, I would characterize them as leftists associated with the movement. We have some, what I would characterize as reactionary type sensibilities associated with the movement, and everything in between. People who are more Luddite, people who are more kind of techno enabling, right? So that's maybe another axis. And so you can imagine that, you throw all these people together in a room, or let's say a large group chat, there's going to be a lot of infighting, right? Like you followed each other because you both like gardening, but it turns out that you're totally different on various political questions. So one way I would describe kind of what's happened with Doomer Optimism is we've gone from a big tent movement, or trying to be a big tent movement. We're trying to fit everybody in the same room and be like, hey, let's connect over these tangible things, and maybe these other political questions either aren't so important, or because we've developed trust around these other things, we can hash out these political things. I think we've moved from that to be like, okay, we're not a big tent, we're more like an encampment, right? Where many different groups, subgroups, have their own little tents, right? But it's still part of an encampment. There's still kind of like this kind of meta protocol or meta political kind of sensibility, but people, some people just can't stand each other, and so they're going off into their own tents or their own group chats or what have you, and so it's kind of like an encampment with still some people who are able to kind of weave in and out of different places, right? So this is where the idea of like mimetic mediation comes in. I've talked about, I think I've talked about before on your podcast, where it's like, okay, like the people who can kind of, relate to pretty different ideologies, or at least get along with people of many different ideologies, can kind of weave in and out. Whereas the people who can't or don't want to kind of just hang out with their own crews, right, and develop their own things. And so I think that's kind of what's been happening with Doomer Optimism. I mean, every few months there's like some kind of big drama, which is probably really funny to outsiders. I personally think that every one of these kind of stress tests just makes us more resilient and stronger. I would say that we're anti-fragile as a movement that way. So yeah, I mean, so maybe that might be kind of some of the drama that you're seeing from the outside, and Twitter itself is a medium that people like to stir up shit on Twitter. Twitter is kind of a shitstorm, as by its nature as a platform. But if you look at the podcast, we put out 2 episodes a week, and I just think they're really high quality conversations. And no matter what's going on in Twitter and people are fighting, like we're still cranking out really good conversations, and many different kinds of conversations with many different hosts who are hosting these conversations, also with their own sensibilities. And so, we've evolved and we've kind of differentiated, but I'd say that, we're as strong or, as resilient as ever.
So it seems then you, by your own account, have a relatively eclectic group of people. What would you say are the main through lines that actually bring them together, besides a sort of sentiment of, I mean, I guess there's a kind of inherent supposition of like impending system collapse, and then a kind of response to that, which is like, you should get ready.
Yeah.
But what are like the main, like, sort of guiding principles that unite this group of people, some of whom are classical leftists, some of whom are more reactionary types, etc.?
So it's funny, when we early on when we got started, we did this thing where we had all kinds of people write their own mini manifestos, and we put them on the Substack. So like 15 or 20 people basically defined what's Doomer Optimism to you, and that was a really interesting exercise. I can't speak for everyone. We haven't formalized in our 10 commandments or something like that. For me, I would characterize it really as a metamodern movement. I think that we're highly influenced by kind of the postmodern critique of grand narratives of modernity, especially the 20th century. But we're also, feel like we can't stop there. We have to move beyond deconstruction. Wait, hold on, let me get a sip of water. We have to reconstruct. We have to start from the ground up. Meanwhile, yeah, many of us do think that kind of our current institutions aren't long for this world. There's different people have different ideas about how long. Like some people are like, we got to, more of the prepper mentality of like everything's going to come down and we got to like, prep, and other people, I'm probably in this latter camp where it's more like a multi-decade process where things, legacy systems are just going to get shittier and shittier. And so let's start investing in the alternatives, right? The alternatives, let's engage in prefiguration, as the anarchists like to say, where, let's create the institutions, the patterns, and the ways of living that are resilient to both, kind of shit hitting the fan, but also can provide a template that can be scaled out, once more and more people realize that the current systems, aren't viable anymore. But to me, that's really that's kind of like very much a metamodern, kind of thing. Now, if you ask most people who are associated with Doomer Optimism, are you a metamodernist? They'd probably say, I don't know what the fuck that is, right? And so,
right.
like the labels don't really matter, but that's just how I characterize it.
Okay, so would you say that you're still sort of in the phase of finding the others?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're trying to do many things at once. We're trying to find the others, create networks, of people all over the place. But we're also, it's not just, part of finding the others is finding people who are doing real interesting things in the world, right? So, one of our taglines is like connecting seekers to doers, right? So, big part of the podcast is like bringing people on either who have a really interesting set of ideas that they're putting forth, or are just doing something really interesting in the world, whether it's maybe they're creating a homeschool cooperative, or they're a permaculture expert, or what have you. And so it's finding the others, but it's also, I think we're very, very much in the early stages of, okay, now we found the others online, we're developing a network, but how does that translate in the tangible physical world, right? And we're still think we're at the very early stages of that. Like we've had like regional meetups where people in like Pacific Northwest, or the Driftless of Wisconsin, or Southern Appalachia, who have kind of met up to these networks, are starting to meet up in real life, and thinking about what can we do together, how can we start building something together. So it's finding the others. It's also just it's developing a very a very healthy and very informative kind of information stack that, okay, if you're plugged into this network, there's just tons of resources available to you, right? You want to learn how to do homesteading, there's tons of resources available to you. You want to again, learn how to do some kind of homeschooling or whatever, there's tons of resources available to you. So yeah, it's that plus other things, I guess.
And so it seems to me like a big emphasis is being put on sort of supply chain, like breakaway supply chains is sort of how I would put it. You want to create your own sources of energy independence, food independence, water independence, but also even maybe an entirely parallel economic system where the members of this community eventually, now I'm sure most of them are not in this phase yet, will get much of their livelihood from actually interacting with other members of the community. It seems to me like that's sort of the long-term vision, whereas right now a lot of what's happening is I don't want to say like parasitizing, because it's not parasitizing, because it's actually still creating value, but you're sort of co-opting the existing system and then using it to bootstrap, building out the alternative sort of parallel, or it's almost like a I forgot what it's called, but like an enclosed container inside of the larger organizational structure that is just sort of like operating by itself. Is there a regional focus on this? Does it not matter whether people are co-located? How important do you think is sort of the physical mapping or proximity of individuals?
Yeah. So on your first point, I don't think I think realistically, we're not trying to create a parallel society where we're kind of completely buffered and closed off from the rest of society. Basically all of us have a foot in mainstream society, right? Our livelihoods, where we work, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, I don't personally see that as a bad thing, right? You have to kind of protect yourself from, what you view as the toxicities from mainstream society. So there's a certain degree of like, you have to maneuver a little bit. But, we're not trying to create this kind of hermetically sealed, secret society. Like that's just not what we're trying to do. Like if anything, we're trying to encourage people to reach out to your normie neighbors, right? And talk to them about, food production or whatever, or just other things that are value to you. And so we're trying to I think, so I would say right now we're kind of in spore mode where, another framing I like is we're trying to build a cosmo-local network. Again, this is my framing. If you ask another Doomer Optimist, they might not think in these terms, but a cosmo-local network where we're basically encouraging localism, but we're doing it over the internet, which is kind of ironic. But the idea is that, when it comes to most of the tangible things in your life, you should try and be as localized as possible. But we should also we should also leverage the power of the internet, this of collective intelligence to, support each other informationally, maybe even, financially or whatever, across localities, right? We're mostly in the United States, but more and more increasingly, in the whole world, right? So for example, we've had a couple of podcasts with some Burmese dissidents, right, who are like basically underground, because of the coup d'etat that happened a few years ago. And basically we have these conversations of like, what are you doing? How are you surviving? How can people support you? Things of that nature, right? And so, we're trying to create this kind of, as far reaching as possible network, right? That also encourages, getting your hands dirty, in your localities where you are. Forget, did that answer your question? What was the second part of your question again?
Well, I mean, yeah, that basically answered the question about sort of co-location of geography.
Oh yeah, let me get to that part. Yeah, so the co-location. Um, what I wouldn't want to see happen is everybody moves to like New Hampshire or something, and we're like the Doomer Optimism state. Like,
yeah, right. We're
I
gonna
don't
take
think
over
that's going to
West
happen.
Virginia.
I don't want that to happen. Um, I if people in the network decide to move near each other, I think that's all to the better. That's great. But I think more the emphasis is on, this is an online network that should support you in building your own, your own thing wherever you happen to be or wherever you decide that you want to be. Um, and but I've plenty of people have met people who are close to them regionally through the network, right? Including me. One of my best friends regionally, he reached out to us because he listened to the podcast, and now he lives an hour away, and he's one of my best friends here, and we help each other in all kinds of things, right? So that's kind of like using the network to actually localize and build these things. So I guess finding the others is both kind of far reaching to the network, but also like using it to create some momentum, where you are. And I tend to take a very kind of bioregionalist kind of view of like scale, where I'm like, okay, I'm really interested in Southern Appalachia as kind of a concept. And so, the more that I can develop very dense networks and community within Southern Appalachia, the better. So that's like, my priority, while I'm still part of this larger network as well. And that's I think what I'll encourage everybody to do.
And one thing I wanted to ask you about that I actually didn't mention when I proposed the show, but is something that's been in the back of my mind since we've been talking, and so I'm sure it's in the minds of many others who might be familiar with the concept, is when you're talking about the formation of an internet community that then reaches back down into the physical world and then becomes a real community. One of the things that comes to mind as a term that's been coined recently is the network state. Balaji Srinivasan's term. I believe I interacted with you a little bit about this last summer when I was reading the book. I read the book like pretty much right after it came out. Very excited about it. My opinions on it have shifted slightly since I first encountered the idea, but I know that the DO community also got a lot of questions and feedback about their sort of take on the network state concept as it was proposed by Balaji Srinivasan. So I wanted to just take the opportunity to ask you, what do you think about the network state, and do you think that the project of DO is commensurate with the network state?
So it's interesting. So I wrote a thread. I haven't read the book, but there was a quote from Balaji's book that I saw, and I wrote a whole thread on it, where at least how it was initially presented to me, I didn't really like it, and the reason is that I felt that that it was too neo-colonial for me, and what I mean by that is that it was this idea of like, okay, a bunch of people who are drawn together based on, a shared set of ideas are going to go basically, buy up this whole, area, set of, area of land, or whole kind of archipelago, I can't even say that word. Anyway, a bunch of different kind of spots of land, and they're gonna have some kind of formal recognition as a state, through the network, but they also have physical holdings. And it seemed to me that it was too cut off from the localities that they were going to set up shop in, right? So it's like, okay, we're going to go set up shop in wherever, Nicaragua, right? And we're going to build this kind of like walled garden that's like one of the land holdings of our network state. And it's like, okay, so you're just like the new colonists, basically, right? Like coming into an area, not interacting, or not being very uh, positive sum with the locals. And so that was kind of my initial how I interpreted it, and I didn't really like that. Balaji actually reached out to me. He responded to me in that thread, and it became a longer thread, and also in DMs. And I think we kind of built a bridge towards that, because I was talking about, the alternative is this kind of cosmolocal network where each node is integrated within their communities and is, building up their communities, and they're not creating this walled garden, right? They're actually benefiting the local economy, et cetera, et cetera. And they're not in an extractive relationship. They're in a regenerative relationship with their localities. And he proposed basically that you could use this network state framework to basically build this new, I forget what league it is. I won't even try and pronounce it. This kind of league of basically a cosmolocal network, in the Middle Ages or something. And you can use kind of the network state protocols and stuff to do that. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, right? And so I warmed up to, some potential applications of the network state idea can be interesting, but it's very important to me, one, that it's not just a refuge for digital nomads who have no stake, no buy-in to their physical locality, and are just going to hop around, to their various holdings, and be the new elite, basically. And I was just like, fuck you guys. If you guys try to come where I live, set up your thing, like you're gonna have problems with us, right? But if it's kind of like a community that seeks to integrate with a larger community that they're a part of, improve it, but also not, just not conquer it, right? Infuse their ideas into it, but also learn from it, learn from their locality, right? And help support the traditions and the culture that was already there, then that could be very promising.
Okay, so it seems to me like your main objection is sort of a perceived power differential between the locals and the members of this.
Yeah,
Whatever.
yeah. I mean, it seemed like these, like the network state could basically become the new global elite, right? Who just kind of like, you know, buy up, buy up all this land all over the place through their network, and basically have their own private armies or whatever, guards, and just,
Yeah.
and just extract from locality and don't really contribute to it. And that would be, I'd have a problem with that.
Well, I mean, I guess I suppose that could be one version of it, but to me at
Mm.
least, and I did read the book. I wrote a review about the book after I read it. I haven't revisited it too much since then, but to me, he did leave the concept open-ended enough that you
Yeah,
could imagine all kinds of variants of the network state that
yeah,
have maybe some of these features that you would be looking for, in
yeah,
terms of, integration into the community. Like one of the core sort of tenets of a network state is that it needs to be formed as a almost quasi-religious community, where the adherents are held together by um a belief in what he calls like a single moral innovation, right?
mhm,
And so depending on what you build your network state around, that moral innovation could have some of these aspects of, we integrate appropriately and socially and economically with the surrounding community. We're not some sort of like secure enclave, which is the word I was looking for earlier.
yeah,
Um, that is just sort of like a members only club where you have to like swipe your ID card and then you can come through the gate and then you get all
Right.
this extra stuff that nobody else around can have.
Right.
Um, so I mean, I guess in my view, um, I'm satisfied enough with leaving open the possibility for different kinds of configurations. And it may be that, you know, one of them that's more exclusionary is just politically untenable. And if that's the case, then it won't survive, and they'll have to adapt, and they'll have to come up with new versions that make more sense in different locales.
Yeah. Yeah. And to his credit, again, he did respond. He made a very good faith effort to respond and persuade. And the league that he was saying that, you know, he was kind of analogizing towards is the Digital Hanseatic League, which was this, you know, I guess again, Middle Ages, you know, but basically it would basically be this idea of cosmolocalism where you have all of these localities all over geographically distributed who are kind of in these kind of collaborative relationships with each other, but are also defining their own cultures, their own, you know, societies, etc. And so I guess, you know, part of it also is because Doomer Optimism is so focused on biophysical issues,
Mm,
like just the fundamentals of life, of life support systems in general, that,
yeah.
you know, these, you know, network states would have to have a real stake in the biophysical, you know, regeneration of, you know, of their localities in the planet. And if they're just kind of extracting value, you know, in kind of this new colonial relationship, not so much.
Mm. All right. So I'm glad that we kind of gave the network state, I think, an appropriate level of treatment.
Mm,
I wanted to actually get into sort of these, what you're calling biophysical um, relationships and systems building a little bit more in depth,
mm,
and sort of move away from DO as a topic.
mm,
And one of the things that you've been doing the last several years and that I've enjoyed watching you do vicariously on Twitter is you yourself are, of course, a homesteader.
mm,
And, you know, since moving down to Appalachia, you've bought some property and you're building out a bunch of stuff. You've got like a chicken coop and a lake and a bunch of crops growing and things like that. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit more, and we've addressed it before, but we might as well, for the new listeners, rehash some of these things. I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of your take on regenerative agriculture and sort of the homesteading movement more generally, and your decision to spend a lot of time on it, because,
mm,
you know, someone that's an educated professional like yourself might look at this activity and say, why are you using your time and your energy
mm,
to like grow your own food on your own property and develop all these um enhancements? uh isn't there a huge opportunity cost there? How do you
mm.
respond to that?
Well, so, you know, my PhD is in applied economics, so I understand the economic worldview of maximizing utility. Um, I mean, first and foremost, you have to ask, what is life for? What do you find valuable in your life, right? Like, what are you trying to maximize? Like, opportunity cost for what? To make more money, to live, you know, in a condo in the city. Is that going to make you happy?
Hmm.
Um, I found that being disconnected from really, you know, all of the sources of my sustenance, uh, I didn't know at the time, but, you know, part of the reason I got so much into meditation for a while was because I was having mental health issues, right? You know, in various manifestations of that. And retrospectively, you know, I think part of that was that, you know, and I think this is just characteristic of modernity in general, and many people, much of the mental health, you know, problems in modernity is that people like their lives have become so abstract, right? They like, if you don't know where anything that supports your sustenance even comes from, right? It just shows up at the door or at a restaurant or at the grocery store. You know, you turn the lights, the light just turns on. Um, I think that there's like this fundamental untethering that, you know, this disembodiment that is incredibly, you know, bad for our mental spiritual health. And so there's that aspect. I also think that there's much of our current, economies, life support systems that just are not sustainable, which means that they're just not going to last in their current form. It doesn't mean that everything is going to collapse. There's going to be an Armageddon. That's not what I'm saying. But I think that many people take for granted just very basic stuff like, their shelter, their food, right, their water, their security and safety. Like it's taken for granted. And we can get into all the reasons why I think that, maybe we shouldn't be taking these things for granted, or we won't be able to take these things for granted for very much longer. And so that there's the kind of the resilience aspect, or and then there's kind of the political economy aspect, where I've come to the conclusion that subsidiarity, localism, but defining localism as subsidiarity, meaning that if you want like localized political independence, you also need some degree of economic independence as well. And you need to be not so completely dependent on a global economic system that might not have your best interests at heart. So the more that you can never be totally buffered from it, but the more that you can be a little bit buffered from it, have a little bit of leeway, that gives you more political independence, I would say, as well, or it can, depending on the context. And so, yeah, so we can dig into any of these three: the spiritual, mental health, the just the resilience aspect, and the political economies aspect. I just think that more localism, I'm not saying that a world where it's completely in the direction of localism is viable. I don't think that as well. I think we do need national and perhaps even international systems as well. I can't my neighbor, I can't dig up the minerals to make my own computer and have my neighbor assemble it for me. That's just not going to happen, right? And so there are some larger scale systems, but I think we've just gone so far in the direction of overscaled, gigantism, I guess you could say, that it's not healthy. It's not resilient. It's not sustainable.
Okay, so I want to get into, let's just go through all three of those points. I think we could try that out.
Sure.
So the first part you talked about was more just like for you on a personal level in terms of the kind of quality of life that you want to be living, in an almost like phenomenological sense, right? I'm reminded when you're speaking about this of the book Shop Class as Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford, which maybe you're familiar with. Relatively popular. What?
Yeah, I've heard about it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, so in this book, he basically is a political theorist who then went and decided to fix motorcycles for a living. Okay, why did he decide to fix motorcycles for a living? Well, essentially, he lays out the argument, and it's very similar to what you described, where there's a kind of alienation that seeps in, for lack of a better term, from his life he was working in like policy or something in DC previously, from just doing this very abstract knowledge work that's not really tied to any real deliverable, for lack of a better term, that actually affects people around you, that actually is integrated holistically into the community, and where you're actually just physically seeing the results of your own work manifest in the world. And so in this book, he makes the case for working with your hands, working in the trades in particular, because of all of these other aspects that you describe, where you're integrated well into the community, you have real relationships with the people around you with your work. You also get the just personal satisfaction of being able to, like, at the end of the day, look literally, like, concretely at the thing you created and have it functioning in the world. He also comments on sort of the feelings of like financial independence or self-sustenance that come from learning a skilled trade in his case, where you don't necessarily need to rely on some corporation or some large organization to support yourself. You can, in theory, go into any town and you have a skill that other people need, that you can market. And that's sort of the thrust of the book. And reflecting on it in my own life, right now I make a living as a software developer.
Mm.
And while that is satisfying some of those needs in terms of I have a real valuable skill, I can create things in the world that other people need and
Yeah.
deliver it to them and do a very direct exchange of value. I can build something. So at the end of the day, I can look at what I've done and I have a real thing and it either works or it doesn't. It's not some sort of word game that I'm playing.
Mhm.
At the same time, it is still very abstract, right? And it's still not very embodied in terms of primarily I'm just working with my cognition
Mhm.
and I'm manipulating all these abstract symbols on a screen. And there's not really a good sense of embodiment. I have to go out into the real world. I have to go to the gym or whatever if I want to get a more embodied
Mhm.
form of like exercise.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, do you find that this work gets helps sort of balance out the other more cognitive stuff that you're doing so you don't just feel like a brain in a jar all the time?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And what you were describing of his describing his process was very similar to mine, where I felt, going for my PhD, writing policy reports, and I was in kind of international markets and development. Like it just felt like you're sending all this effort out into kind of the void, and you have no idea what impact it's going to have, if any. Probably not going to have any impact at all. And there's many reasons for that. And yeah, I think that just this lack of feedback of
Mm.
just very abstract work. It's not really tied to anything tangible around you. Like that's not our evolutionary environment. There's this evolutionary mismatch there. And it can, and so I think that was part of my kind of psycho-spiritual challenges, right? I will say that. So, I mean, so I teach, part of what I do is I teach. I also work on the side as a landscaping company, and it doesn't pay well, but, I enjoy it. And everything that you described, and then I also work on my homestead, everything that you described, I think is very much true. Uh, there's kind of instant feedback, right? Like either your chicken coop keeps out predators or it doesn't, right? Either your crops
Mm.
grow or they don't, that kind of thing. Or either your clients with the landscaping, the house you're doing, either they like what you did or they don't. And it's very instant feedback. Um, I can see what you're describing with software being satisfying in that way as well. Like there's a little bit more direct tie to like, did this create value or not? And you can see how it created value. But then of course there's that embodiment aspect. I also like the teaching. I enjoy exploring ideas with young people, trying to help stretch people's minds a little bit. And that's more of the cognitive, that's more of the abstract, and then the podcasting is also very abstract. So I kind of see it as a barbell strategy. Like, I think intellectualism is good. Like I'm not an
Mm.
anti-intellectualist. I think expanding conceptual space is good, but you really do need to balance that out with just being like physical. In our case, a physical man, right? Who just does shit and gets things done, and you can see it right there. And so yeah. So I think for me, barbell strategy. Having myself rooted down a little bit and really kind of embodied also affords me to kind of go out there as far as I need and not get lost or not go insane, right? It kind
Mm.
of provides a nice tether for me. And it also, it's a generator of ideas, right? You're working with living systems. You're kind of connected to, I think, one of the main sources of ideas themselves, right? Like, you're connected to, living systems. Of course, there's many analogies of how, of how a garden can be related to life, of like, having patience, moderating your kind of nervous system to not want instant reward necessarily, but like you plant a tree and then 10 years later you get the fruit kind of thing. So there's a lot of like analogies that I think are very real of, of how, um, of how ideas can be generated from. I know you've interviewed Matthew Perkowski on your podcast, and I have as well. And I think we both know that he's really brilliant. And
Mm,
he describes this very well, of like how he's also homesteading, right, and how he connects these kind of like very physical things with these, he's very much on the cutting edge of a lot of, you know ideas that, I think are very innovative, and I think that's a very real thing.
yeah, I didn't actually know that Matthew was also homesteading, so that's news to me.
Yeah, he's been
Um,
doing it for a couple of years.
but yeah, so I guess, maybe someone who studied complexity a little bit more has a better vocabulary to kind of describe some of these concepts
Yeah.
um, in more detail, like Matthew does. I'd love to talk to him again sometime. Maybe we'll do that soon. So I want to get into the second point here, which is sort of about resilience.
Mm.
And obviously, growing your own food, having your own chicken coop, crops, other things like that. It's all part of, in a way, making yourself more resilient. Now, obviously, in the country that you're living in the part of the country that you're in, it's not as if there's any genuine concern for food supply or availability of food. And hopefully there won't be for a very long time. Um, but how do you think about sort of building this out for yourself and your own resilience? Obviously, in 2020 and 2021, there was a little bit of a shaky time there where people were unsure, um, you know, whether the supermarkets were going to be stocked for a while with a lot of the supply chain issues. So
Mm.
I guess the first part of this would be, did having that as a backup in your own life just sort of give you a little bit of reassurance that, probably you were going to be okay, even if things did go a little bit haywire for a while? And then the second part of this um, is, you know, is also part of it just sort of modeling resilience for your neighbors, as well as, I mean, I know you have children, as well as for them, like,
Mm.
hey, this is where your food comes from. It doesn't just appear magically on the shelf,
Mm.
and you have the capacity within you to provide it. And also, frankly, probably higher quality food in many cases than you would be
Definitely
getting
higher
at
quality food.
many
Yeah.
supermarkets. So how are you thinking about resilience?
Yeah, I mean, both of those things you said resonate. I did feel a little bit more secure, whether I actually was like I'm not gonna pretend that I'm anywhere near like self-sufficient. I'm
Mm,
not, and I don't think that's really the goal, to be self-sufficient as a homestead. I think the goal is, is really just to provide, some of your food, but also have surplus that you can give away or barter with other people, gift to other people or barter. But really, my interest really is in local food systems in general, and that's kind of my academic interest as well, right? And this gets to the second side point of what you said, of like, and this idea of prefiguration, of where, I don't think that industrial food system as it's currently composed is sustainable. Like I don't think it's going to be reliably giving us food forever. And so from my view, we better start building up the alternatives now. Now, luckily, where I live has a very strong local food culture, and it goes back hundreds of years. Um, but it can always be improved, of course. And so, one, I just see a society in general. If I picture like a more ideal society, it's one where the majority of people produce a little bit, right? They're producers, right? Whether it's just producing herbs on your windowsill, or having a couple raised box beds where you grow vegetables, to having livestock, to, hydroponics, fruit trees. I just think that, a world where every locality is just teeming with people producing food is just a healthier society, right? The food, where the food's coming from. The food's healthier in general, right? There's because it's not shipped so far and genetically modified to be shippable, but in that process, often loses taste or loses nutrition as well. Um, I just think that's, it's a more ideal society is one where, many people, if not most people, are producing at least a little bit. And then, some things, uh, you know, growing grains, for example, is kind of hard to do at a small scale. And so, I'm not completely against larger scale, especially for grain production. Although I think that we also have to change some of those practices to be more, regenerative in general. So I don't know if I answered your question. Uh, it gives me a lot of satisfaction to eat, many of my meals with ingredients that I grew myself, or that I know where I know where the meat came from, right? So I have this arrangement right now where, so I'm on 5 acres. I'm not using a lot of it yet. And
Mhm.
so a local guy hays it, and we have a deal, a sharecropping deal, where basically he gives me half the value of the hay. I can't use all that hay, and so but he has cows, and so he gives me half the value in beef, right? And so that's pretty sweet, right? And
Yeah.
then I also have other meat that I buy from friends, or just people where I know who they are. I've been to their farms. I
Mhm.
know how they raise their animals, and so that's pretty satisfying. And I think it creates, when you're creating these functional relationships, right? Where like, now I have this relationship with this local guy, who's an old timer here in this region. I'm not just, I'm still an outsider, but I'm less of an outsider, right? Like, we have a positive sum relationship. We're less likely to try and want to do harm to each other, right? We have these functional. This is like the Adam Smith hypothesis of like,
Right, right. Very
right,
like
gains from trade,
basis
gains
of
from bartering, gains
economics.
from trade. Yeah, this is like localized economics, where you
Mhm.
actually, you actually know the person where you got your stuff from, and that's pretty cool. Um, and I think we're eventually as a society going to have to um, relocalize, especially. I mean, again, we can't relocalize everything, but especially food. I think there's a lot of scope for relocalization. I think that'll just it'll address so many problems of our modern society, from mental health to sustainability to to other things, that it's just, to me, it's a no-brainer.
This will segue into sort of the third point on this,
Mm.
which is, are there any kind of like regulatory barriers to engaging in this way, and on sort of like a peer-to-peer basis? I know, for example, I've spoken with cattle farmers on Clubhouse who've told me that there are issues with the FDA where for example, my understanding is, and I could be miswording some of this, they're unable to sell you basically a whole cow. Like, as a consumer, they
Yeah.
can't, you can't go to someone and say, you can't go to a farmer and say, I want to buy a whole cow or half a cow. I have like a deep freezer.
Mhm.
I'm gonna like do all this stuff. There's like very weird stuff, especially if you're trying to do like interstate commerce or whatever,
Mhm.
um, related to how they regulate meat production and butchering and all of that stuff,
Yeah.
meat processing, where they have to go through certain facilities, they have to be able to go through certain checks in order
Mhm.
for it to be commercially viable. And
Yeah.
so I was just wondering, have you encountered any kind of limits like this where the existing system is just not set up to even allow you to do certain things?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of regulatory barriers. I mean, one that a lot of people complain about are homeowners associations, right? If you're wanting to like have some, small scale livestock, or grow food in like a suburb with an HOA, oftentimes you're going to run into a lot of problems, right? So there's
Yeah.
that. Um, a lot of the regulatory things around food safety. So of course we want our food to be safe, right? And so, you could say in theory, there's good reason for these food safety regulations. But of course, the regulatory process often gets corrupted. Um, I think what's happened, and this has happened not just in food, but in many industries, where the larger corporations are pro-regulation because they can easily pay the lawyers to work that out for them, whereas that's a barrier to entry for the smaller guy, right?
Mhm.
And so, some of these regulations then become like, you basically just like, you need a full-time lawyer basically to jump through all the hoops, which, and then of course that smothers local enterprise, and that it becomes oppressive, right? And so that's very much a real thing. um, in terms of like, I also think thinking about regulation differently is important. Like, if you're selling something at a farmer's market, I think that there should be a little bit higher standard of like, is this food safe or not, right? And so there has to be some minimum viable checks. If you're trading it with your neighbors, I think that that minimum viable threshold should be much lower, right?
Mm.
Whereas like if we're engaged in just a peer-to-peer relationship, however, whether that's gifting or barter or there's some kind of monetary transaction involved, that's where kind of my libertarian impulse comes in, right? Or agorist impulse of like, it's nobody's business but ours, right? if I see how they raise their animals or whatever, I see how they butcher them, then then the state shouldn't come in and tell me that I can't buy from them. Of course, people get around that, right? Like you buy a share in the cow, you become a co-owner of the cow, and that gets
Right.
around.
Yeah. That's exactly what
Yeah.
they talked about. They're like, you set up like a trust and then like,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
but it's just ridiculous. They have to go through all that, all that stuff to begin with.
Mm.
As far as butchering, so one issue we have here up mountain is that there's no good place to butcher large livestock like cows here. It has to be off mountain right now. And that's just kind of like, there's regulatory issues which make it difficult, and just, getting the coordination and capital together that, we can, butcher closer to home. Now, of course, I prefer some kind of system where you can have like a mobile butchering thing where like somebody basically comes with a trailer to your place, and it basically happens on farm, and it's streamlined, and that would be great. Part of the reason why, so I eventually want to get larger livestock. I don't have yet. I want to use this land for things besides just hay and planting trees and stuff. And one reason I probably opt for sheep or goats is that the butchering is a lot easier. And like for cows, I'd have to basically both legally and logistically, I'd have to do it off mountain. Whereas with sheep, I could probably learn to do it myself or get some friends, to help me out, or that capability is very hyper local. And that it's perhaps I would opt to get cows, but it's just, that's a regulatory and just a logistical issue that, would prevent that.
Mm. So now that we've talked a little bit about sort of like, some of the broader regulatory challenges, obviously, I mean, I'm not sure if the listeners really care for us to get like super into specifics of like food regulations.
Yeah.
But I thought we'd move on to sort of the political economy aspects of this, because, you and I have interacted briefly on Twitter about this. And I think it is sort of like one of the stronger objections to regenerative agriculture as a movement. If you're very cynical, you just say, well, maybe someone for ideological reasons or just personal satisfaction wants to engage in this activity, even though, maybe a strictly utilitarian analysis might tell you that it's like unproductive labor, or low productivity labor. But there's still just a problem with making the political economy of this kind of thing actually scale up, right? And so the objection is, you can do this for yourself. Maybe you could do this in a small community, but it will never achieve the kind of scale, the kind of systemic change that you're envisioning, because of the fact that like returns to scale and other things that are inherent to the existing industrial food system are just too great to overcome. How are you thinking about the political economic challenges to regenerative agriculture?
They're definitely very,
Localism.
very high. I mean, we're definitely swimming upstream, and there's multiple reasons for that. Economies of scale arguments, that's somewhat valid, although I would say that well, one, as a society, our government is it's not a free market. Like we're subsidizing commodity corn production for ethanol, which is just a ridiculous policy, it's a complete boondoggle, or to provide feed for, cattle and concentrated feeding operations, which also has, pretty negative ethical dimension as well as not being sustainable. We can get into why that would be. So there's, so one is like, we're not playing on a level playing field, right? The subsidies are still very much tilted towards supporting the large scale commodity farmers. Now, they're also subsidized by cheap diesel fuel. They're subsidized by uh, uh, fertilizers, petrofertilizers, which are derived from natural gas, right? So the whole system right now is completely dependent on abundant and cheap fossil fuels. If that were to change, um, and there's a lot of people who, think that we're at or near peak oil or, peak fossil fuels, and it's going to get more and more expensive to extract. That would change the calculus significantly. There's also the externalities issue where, many of the environmental externalities of industrial agriculture, they're very numerous. There's I could list off a whole thing. Losing topsoil, biodiversity loss, compacting the soil, so you're not recharging the aquifer, so you start having water crises, water pollution. All the chemicals get into the water supply, get into our bodies, right? Create all kinds of unknown illnesses and pathologies, probably in society. Create dead zones in the ocean. If you're there's also the carbon cycle as well. Much of industrial agriculture releases carbon from the soil, where it's actually a very good use into the atmosphere, which reflects sunlight, which creates climate weirding and various heating, and just we can get that's a whole rabbit hole there. And so there's many, and then there's also regional fragility, right? So like most farmers in Iowa, for example, have to go to the supermarket to basically buy all of their food, right? You can say, oh, that's efficient. They're monocropping, that's efficient. But right. If there was an energy shock, or there was a fertilizer price shock, or suddenly, the climate started getting weirder and weirder, and their crops were failing, then suddenly they'd be as fragile as everyone else. Contrast that with a few decades ago, when many more people had smaller farms, many even commodity farmers also had their own gardens, also produced food for themselves and their community. That's less and less these days, although not completely gone. And so if you take all those things into account, there's just a lot of, if you're thinking in terms of a utility maximizing framework, there's a lot of costs to the current system that aren't being accounted for. So what does that mean for people who are seeing regenerative agriculture as kind of a way forward? Right now, I still think we're in prefiguration mode, and I keep using this term, I know, but I think at this point, with the current structural conditions as they are, there's not going to be like this, revolution towards regenerative agriculture. I think what we're trying to do is basically, in very difficult conditions, swimming upstream, we're trying to prove out viable systems, right? And we're in the proof of concept stage. And I think that when the structural conditions change, again, if the price of energy changes, if diesel fuel becomes less available, for example, or if the climate gets weirder, or what have you, then the whole calculus is going to shift. And suddenly, even from a just a bare bones economic analysis, regenerative agriculture is going to start looking more and more attractive, and more profitable as well. So I guess that's kind of a nutshell version. I mean, there's a great article called "The Political Economy of Agroecology," which kind of gets into these issues of industrial agriculture relies on external inputs. It's a part of a linear system model. It has these waste products that don't get reintegrated. It gets dispersed into the environment itself. Whereas agroecology, there's not the same as regenerative agriculture, but there's a lot of similarities. It produces some more circular system. It regenerates a lot of its own inputs, and it has a lot less pollution in general associated with the process. It is more labor intensive. So this is a big thing. Is that
so
there's no
externalities.
Let me just finish testing. There's no getting around the fact that regenerative agriculture, agriculture, what have you, would be more labor intensive. And what that would mean is that we would need, and just if you want smaller scale farms, you just need more farmers, right? There's no way around that. And so when they say that industrial agriculture is more efficient, usually what they're saying is that it has a higher labor productivity. And so we would need many more people to get involved with food production, whether them as a farmer or as a homesteader or informal, just food production. there would just need many more people involved with that. Shoot, there's one more add-on point I was going to make there. Anyway, I forgot the last thing I was going to say. Go ahead.
Oh, well, so I guess that was a lot. There's one sort of thing that I wanted to clarify just for the listeners, so that just because I think it's an important point to illustrate and make more explicit. And then there's another thing that's sort of just commentary on what you just stated. So the first thing I would say is that there's a lot of people don't realize when they're talking about utility maximization that this is like a characteristic of systems in general, that there's a trade-off between efficiency and redundancy, right? And when you make a system more efficient, almost by definition, you make it less redundant, and that actually makes it fragile. And so what really we're talking about is that the focus on hyper optimization for efficiency makes our food system fragile. And you actually want some inefficiency, you want some redundancy in order to make it more resilient, make it more robust. And so that's sort of what, like one part of what you're saying is the system failures will make the cost of doing it this way too high for people to continue on this, trajectory. And then the other part you're saying is that there are sort of additional externalities that are not being priced into the current system, right? And with agroecology, you're actually taking all those externalities into account, and you're having a more holistic system design where things are priced in appropriately.
Well,
and I mean, I was taking some notes. But so I just wanted to, I guess, clarify those two aspects of what we've been discussing, so that people can get a better picture in their heads about why this is important and why this matters, and why it's not just sort of like doom pontificating or something about food supply chains or something like that. There are very important structural system dynamics at play that we should be thinking about when we're considering, why these things might be more tenable in the future.
I mean, one thing I'll just note real quick is that you can't hyper optimize for either resilience or efficiency to the exclusion of the other. Like, you need a balance, right? Like you don't want it to be so inefficient or so redundant that you just don't, your productivity plunges, right? You don't want to be so efficient that suddenly, you become very fragile to any kind of system shock. I think we've gone too far in the efficiency hyper optimization, and we have to kind of move back towards the center. So we still want to, find how can we make these processes more efficient. And I think a big part of permaculture and the permaculture movement in general that's fascinating is that people are just constantly tinkering and figuring out, how can I make this whole system not to optimize one crop, but say, a number of different outputs? How can I improve this system? How can I, using systems thinking is very much a complexity kind of framework. How can we stack more and more functions, right? If I'm putting out something, like if I put out a fence here, can it serve 3 different functions instead of 1, right? How can we improve efficiency, but within a framework that, within a more holistic framework that, by the way, also accounts for more externalities and not only decreases negative externalities, but produces positive externalities as well, right? Like, so for example, if you have more biodiversity, that provides pollinator habitat, which benefits not just your farm, but many different farms, right? And one of the many negative externalities of industrial agriculture is we have a pollinator crisis, right? The bees are dying. If our pollinators die, and unless we can replace them with little drone bees, which I think is a pretty ridiculous idea, we're gonna there will just be famine, right?
Right.
So there's all so just wanted to add that it's seeking out efficiencies, but within a more holistic framework. And I think you kind of framed it that way, which is nice.
Yeah, so that's sort of like one way of thinking about it. One thing I wanted to ask you about the low productivity of labor and about how these sort of alternative political economic arrangements might, increase labor costs is automation, right? So automation is one way that you can reduce labor costs, and you can increase the efficiency of labor. And if I was to imagine myself, you know, I show up in your homestead one day and I say, we're going to start like doing all kinds of automation and monitoring of your crops. I'm going to like take a bunch of Raspberry Pis and like stick them everywhere and start doing all kinds of like weird IoT stuff with like water systems and other things like that. That's one way that I imagine that's sort of like a techno optimist way of integrating this, where you could have, I could imagine at least a bunch of small homesteads or farms that are doing regenerative, agriculture, agroecology, but they're leveraging computer systems and other kinds of automation to make it, extremely efficient to be able to keep doing what they're doing and not have to employ a huge amount of labor. What sort of like solar punk, I guess. What do you think of that concept?
I think there's some scope for that. I think that there is some scope for automating tasks. I mean, a very simple example, maybe a trivial example, but is like, so I have a solar powered automatic chicken door opener, right? And that saves me having to go down and open up the chicken coop,
Yeah.
and so that's just, that's great. And I'm glad that the technology was developed. I think some degree of monitoring, that you can kind of monitor, plant health or soil health or whatever using these systems is good. But I also think that you have to be a little bit discerning, like not just, the fanciest new gadget for its own sake, right? You have to be very discerning about what are the trade-offs here. So, one trade-off of, just bringing in robots to everything is that robots, require materials, right? Well, one of the biophysical limits that we're running up against is that we're starting to run out of a lot of the key precious metals that we need for, even many of our what we call like green energy systems, right? Cobalt, copper, lithium, right? Like these are going to we're going to start hitting some limits as to how much of this stuff we can extract, and especially in certain periods of time. And then there's the trash issue, right? Like it breaks down. What are you gonna do with all this trash, right? And so I think there's definitely some scope for automation for some labor saving. I don't think we can or should go back to pre-industrial peasant agriculture. I don't think that's what we're trying to do. We do want to save some labor, so we don't have 90% of the population is involved with agriculture. But I do think realistically we would need maybe 10 to 20% of people, maybe 10% involved almost full-time in agriculture and another 40% involved partially in growing some kind of food. And why can we do that? Well, because we have the technology, we have the knowledge that we didn't have in the past. So we can use that to our advantage. But you just have to look for what are these trade-offs. Is there a lower tech, lower material intensive, lower energy intensive option available that's just as good or just quite as good, right? So you have to take a full kind of wide boundary systems, kind of analysis into account of like, is this fancy new gadget actually worth it if we're actually accounting for the real cost of the embodied energy in this product, including mining, manufacturing, et cetera, waste disposal, are we going to automate ourselves out of existence? That's a much broader, a lot of the people who are very concerned about AI are concerned that we're going to, with AI and robots, we're going to automate humans out of existence. They're going to find us redundant and they're going to kill us, right? That's what the world are worried about.
We're a long ways away.
Yeah, maybe, but AI has these kind of recursive, like it can speed up very quickly.
Yes.
I happen to think that we are a long way away of robots being able to basically, run a homestead operation. I think that would be very far in the future, and I don't think that would actually happen. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think there is scope with some automation on the homestead, some tech, but we just have to have discernment and take a wide boundary systems kind of analysis of what do we bring on and what do we not bring on.
Right. And I think this is sort of one area where perhaps you and I have a little bit of disagreement. I mean, it's okay for us to disagree, I think. Um,
Okay.
I'm more of like I'm like a high energy futurist. So I imagine a future where more humans are consuming even more energy than they were before. Now, I'm not sure as much about the material constraints. There may
Yeah.
be some more serious, like rare earth metals, rare earth mineral material constraints. I haven't done the full analysis on that. And to be honest, I haven't done the full analysis on energy either, but I'm generally pro energy. I want more people using more energy, and I want to find solutions for doing that.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, I'm not going to make it like a big point of contention, but it is just sort of a difference between us that I think is worth acknowledging. Um, I
I
don't know
had
if
a
you have
I had a
anything to say about
conversation with on Gregory Landra's podcast. He has a planetary regeneration podcast with him and Matthew Burkowski,
it.
where
Yeah.
I was basically debating them on this exact point. Um,
Hmm.
and it wasn't really a debate; it was more of a co exploration. So, I mean, I think it's a possibility, and this is kind of what Gregory argues and Matthew argues, that we can have high energy regeneration if we get the monetary system right, if we get kind of the incentive landscape right, where basically, like right now, if we added a lot of energy system, I just think we would speed up planetary overshoot, biophysical overshoot faster, even if it was clean energy, right? So say we're not putting out as much carbon in the atmosphere, we're still polluting the oceans, we're still destroying biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. We're still extracting materials faster and faster. It's possible. I remain somewhat skeptical, but not closed off to the possibility that you could have a high energy regeneration where you're starting to close linear systems, make them into circular systems. You're developing the technology to recycle materials at a kind of an atomic level.
Hmm.
Metamaterials, where you can start taking things out of the waste stream and reforming them back into material. Like so, I can see that is a potential trajectory, maybe. Um, the question is, where does this energy come from? This gets into like, if we're putting all of our hopes on fusion energy, for example, I still think that's a huge wild card. And I don't think anybody really knows if that's going to be viable in, say, 30 years and scalable in 30 years. I just don't think anyone knows. I do think that, uh, our technology so far has kept up, like we've been extracting fossil fuels. They're getting harder to reach. Our technology has been keeping up with that. Our extraction technology has been keeping up with that pretty well. Um, I don't think that that's going to go on forever. And right now, 20% of the global economy is run by electricity, right?
Hmm.
And so, the rest is run by liquid fuels, basically, and coal. Um, so even if we were to, like build, moonshot solar panel, wind turbines, fourth generation nuclear, whatever, we'd still just be producing electricity. We don't currently use electricity to make our concrete, to make our steel, to make our fertilizers. All of the mining and fabrication to even produce these these green energy technologies require fossil fuels. We're very, very, very far from being able to maintain our, to be able to basically switch to say green energy, low externality energy. Like we're just not even close yet. And so then the question is, well, high energy, if we're doing high energy for high energy's sake, if we're wasting energy, that's not very good. The energy we have, I would say most of, all of the conspicuous consumption, is very wasteful, especially in Western societies.
Hmm.
Where is this energy where is this gonna come from? Again, if it comes down to fusion gets online, it's this breakthrough technology. Um, that would solve a lot of problems for sure. Not all of them, not the liquid fuels problem per se, but it would solve a lot of problems. But we'd still, like, if we did that without changing the monetary basing basically our monetary system in
Yeah.
biophysical health and natural resource availabilities, basically eco-basing our currencies, then it would probably just speed up planetary collapse.
So I guess your main objection is, I mean, there's a objection about like, okay, we're just not ready for that yet. That's fair enough. And then the other thing is sort of that it might just enable us, this sort of way of thinking might just enable us to exacerbate existing pathologies and not actually deal with the problem.
Yeah.
Now, my response to that is that, well, look, I don't want to exacerbate unsustainable system configurations either.
Mm.
But at the same time, you know, I don't think that like it's fair to humanity to just give them the strong medicine, which is like some sort of degrowth future, some sort of low energy future that immiserates millions and millions of
Yeah.
people. I mean,
Well, let's real quick. Let's get into this idea of degrowth because I think that there's not very much precision around this idea. So
mhm.
I think maybe we can agree that GDP is a shit measurement of human well-being. Would you
Yeah,
agree with that statement?
no, yeah, I agree with that. Of course.
So then the question is, okay, I mean, I think degrowth, I think that word is itself is problematic because we don't. There's many things that we want to grow, right? I would say we do want to get degrowth, just total linear throughput, extraction, throughput, and waste, right? This linear system. I do think we want to degrow that, and I think maybe we can agree on that. And so in one sense that would be degrowth, and GDP is really measures that activity, right?
Mhm.
If there's an oil spill in the ocean and you spend billions of dollars cleaning it up, that contributes to GDP, right? If you cut down a rainforest to grow soybeans for cows, and you screw up the whole hydrologic cycle for the whole Earth, that contributes to GDP, right? None of the costs, maybe the costs, and even like the hurricanes that come because the hydrologic cycle is messed up, creates disasters, and then the rebuilding contributes to GDP, right? And so
Mhm.
there's many, I think, alternative indicators of health, more holistic indicators of health that takes into account, might take into account, just total level of inequality in society. It might take into account environmental externalities, quality of life, how happy are people, various happiness indices and all of these things. I think if we got our metric right of what we want to grow, then this whole degrowth growth thing would be a moot point, right? We'd be like, okay, of course we want to grow the things that are good and we want to decrease the things that are bad, right? And so
Mhm.
we want to grow, we want to regrow topsoil, right? We want to regrow human connection and strong, viable communities where people have a meaning and purpose in their life. We want to decrease existential despair, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think, yeah. So when we talk, I guess I just wanted to throw that kind of caveat out there that, just to make this conversation more precise of like degrowth of what, growth of what, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. We can get into the semantics of it, but I think just generally speaking, I mean, I agree with all of those points that like we want to have a more holistic conception of human flourishing. GDP is like a terrible way of capturing it. Um, it, and there's all these like broken window fallacies and other things you can do with it to sort of jerry rig it, and there's over financialization and other things like that that again are not really reflective of like the underlying health of the economy. um so all of those are like good points, but I think the issue for me is just sort of the framing of like we want people to consume less, we want people to use less energy. It's sort of I mean, I just don't see the people that say that often actually doing that in their own lives. And then
True.
B,
True.
uh it's always sort of this thing of like, well, if you're an American that's saying that, you're already like using way more resources on an annual basis than most people around the world, and many orders of magnitude more than most people throughout human history.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, it's sort of just like you're it it tastes like somebody trying to deny that life to someone else. And that's
So
sort of
just,
my main issue.
I will make a clarification here that most serious degrowth theorists would say that the poorest countries in the world need to still grow.
Mm,
It's aggregate degrowth. They would say that Americans, other Western societies just need to use less energy, less materials overall. So I just want to throw that caveat because I think that's a common misunderstanding. Is like it's not degrowthers aren't saying, oh, poor Haiti, like you're in a collapsed society right now, but you can't grow. Like we're in this new political program. Like that's not what the degrowth movement is really saying. Now, of course, people can take exception to like American lifestyles, American fuck yeah, like we don't want some global panel of degrowthers saying what we can and can't do. And I totally understand that sentiment. But I would challenge again, what is it that contributes to the good life, right? Is it,
Mm.
is our, insane amount of conspicuous consumption, especially in American society and other countries as well, is that really making us happier, right? Is, buying new clothes every few weeks instead of fixing the clothes that you have, is that really making us happier? Is you can get into. I mean, there's many examples I can give there, right? Where I think it's.
Well,
I don't think it's true that
mm,
we need this much consumption, especially in a linear system. Um, I don't think it's true that we need this much consumption as a society to maintain a high quality of life. And I actually think we can increase our quality of life. We're moving from a consumeristic society to a producerism. I like this frame,
yeah, yeah. Well, that's a nice framing.
consumerism to producerism, right?
Yeah,
Where
right.
more and more people locally are producing their own stuff. It's more resilient. It's also a little bit less efficient. And so there's like an implicit degrowth in there, but it's from the bottom up. It's not imposed from the top
Mhm.
down, right? And so like, if more people locally are making their own stuff, they're probably going to build it to last. That you're not going to have, built for the dump. They're going to be less influenced by advertising saying that, their life sucks unless they buy the new gizmo or the new gadget that they're going to throw out,
Right, right.
in a few weeks. There's a lot of parts of our consumer society that are actually making us less spiritually healthy and aren't contributing to quality of life. So I would say we need to have a careful conversation about like, what is it that gives us a high quality of life? The more we produce for ourselves, the more that we can define that for ourselves, but we're also going to be probably become less consumeristic. And that will implicitly mean less energy material throughput overall.
Well, I mean, of course, I don't think that consumption for the consumption's sake is necessarily a good or healthy culture to have.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with many of those points. I guess the issue with me is it strikes me as a kind of like asceticism. Um, and and then I get like alarm bells in my head. It's like, this is communism, right? Like
Mhm.
going off, and I'm like, you know, I just don't want people telling people what they can and can't do, even though I want to. Um, I generally agree. I mean, for me myself personally, I don't consume a lot of stuff. I don't buy a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I believe in like a supply side view of life. Like you should be producing things,
Yeah.
mostly, and then the excess consumption you should be like reinvesting capital into producing more stuff, basically.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we're in a lot of agreement there, and maybe this is more like a framing issue. And
Yeah.
a lot of the debate, unfortunately, has already been framed for us by other people having arguments about, degrowth, growth, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, maybe we can revisit this at some other time.
Yeah.
Um, with that being said, Jason, I think we're basically out of time here.
Okay.
So I want to just like thank you for coming on.
Yeah.
I don't want to just leave everybody hanging though. So I guess one last thing before I let you go. Um, what is like sort of your hope for the DO community and plans for the future? What are you the most optimistic about right now? Let's leave on a high note.
Yeah. One thing is that there's more and more people who are part of the network who are meeting up locally. Um, Last year we had a few regional meetups. We had a couple regional meetups with like an event, with like a lot of people getting together and doing some kind of practical thing, a workshop. This fall I'm getting meat chickens this fall, and I'm probably going to invite a bunch of friends, both locally that I just know locally, but also people who are part of this larger network to come help me process chickens. It's free labor. But it will also everybody will learn things how do you process chickens. And people go home with some of that as well. And so that's exciting for me, the prospect of actually building things in real life. The podcast is always very exciting, just because I just think we continue to have a lot of fascinating conversations with many different kinds of people. And so that's just constantly exciting to me, of like just building out the network itself. That's fun. What else? Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone through, we're kind of going through this evolutionary transition right now. Like I kind of alluded to it earlier, where I think we're moving from more of a big tent thing to more of like, a campground kind of model. And so, and I think we're at a phase. I think DO is kind of anti-fragile to system shocks. And so what that means on one side is that when there's like a crisis, there's like a war, prospect, there's, pandemic and lockdowns, or there's, reports from the news of a food crisis, then, a lot of energy comes into DO, and everyone's like, hey, this is what we're built for. Fuck yeah. When things are kind of like, at least in the news, things are just kind of like, things are okay right now. There's kind of like a calm period. Then there's not as much energy coming in, because people are focused on other things. And I think that's where we are right now, where we're just kind of like, we're just doing our thing, cranking out podcasts, expanding the network. But I do see, I do see us as being well placed to, be very helpful in future shocks that I think are inevitably coming. Whether, and we don't know what those are, right? We don't know if it's, whatever, it's war, some kind of AI, craziness, some kind of, energy shock, climate related, natural disasters. Like, we don't know, right? But I think that, we're just right now, we're kind of just, in kind of a calm mode, just doing our thing, but developing capacity. And so it's not like edge of our seat exciting, but it's kind of like, yeah, this is this is good. So that itself is exciting. It's just just slowly developing, slowly building. Yeah.
Good steady progress and
Yeah.
capacity for responsiveness.
Yeah.
All right, well, Jason, it's been a pleasure having you on. As
Yeah.
always, we always have a great time.
It's always a pleasure coming on your podcast. You asked very good questions. Yeah, and you're a great, kind of, you're a great interlocutor in terms of a little bit challenging, where we're coming from, and you ask good questions. You ask the right questions. So I really appreciate coming on your podcast.
Yeah, and I mean, again, likewise. I mean, I always have a good time. You're a nice. I mean, it's always nice to just speak with other like flexible thinkers. I
Yeah.
don't like people that get to like too bogged down in their rigidity,
Right.
and and even myself, you get pressure to sort of like fit into some ideological mold, and
Yeah.
I hate the feeling. It's icky. Anyway, thank you, Jason, for coming on. Jason Snyder on Twitter at Cognazer. The podcast is Doomer Optimism. They're everywhere. And you can go check them out, and you can learn more about what they're doing. All right. That's all, folks.
Cool. Thanks, Alex. Take care.